Welcome to Chapter 2. On this unit, we will talk about the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. So for the TEAS exam, you will need to know the various parts of the respiratory system and how they contribute to the function of the body. You will also want to be familiar with common respiratory problems or diseases and how they affect the system's function. The respiratory system works with the circulatory system, so you will need to understand how these organs interact, how the systems interact. So some of the learning goals for this chapter are we need to explain the function of the respiratory system, and we need to identify the structure of the system, and we also need to explain the role of the respiratory system in gas exchange. And finally, we need to describe the relationship between the respiratory and the cardiovascular system. So let's get started. So the primary function of the respiratory system is to make it easier to take oxygen from the environment and to remove carbon dioxide, which is a toxic gas, from the body. So the respiratory system is composed of several structures that work together to facilitate the process of providing oxygen to body cells while removing the toxic carbon dioxide. So this process is also known as respiration, the removal of CO2 and the infusion of O2. So the structure of the respiratory system, it contains the nasal cavity, which warms and moistens and filters the inhaled air. And then we have the pharynx. The pharynx is also known as the throat. Pharynx is just the terminology for throat, and it's a muscular tube that connects the nasal cavity and the mouth, and it connects it all to the larynx, which is the voice box. And the pharynx also acts as a passage for air or for food. And then, like I said, we have the larynx, like you can see on the screen. We have the larynx here, and the larynx is located at the top of the trachea, and it contains the vocal cords. The main function of the larynx is to have the vocal cords. It plays a crucial role in producing sound, and also it prevents food from entering the respiratory system, because food needs to go down the correct tube, which we will talk about in the digestive system. So after that, we have the trachea, and the trachea is also, you can think of it as a windpipe. It's a tube that connects the larynx to the bronchi. Like you can see, we are just going all the way down from the nose, the mouth, the throat, the voice box, the throat, the trachea, all the way down to the lungs. So the trachea is that tube that connects the larynx to the bronchi. It produces mucus that helps filter and move debris out of the respiratory system. And the trachea also makes sure that food does not enter the respiratory system, but enters the stomach instead. The tube that makes sure that food goes down to the intestine and not to the lungs is the trachea. And after that, we have the bronchioles and the bronchi. Bronchioles is just a cute little name. That means smaller. They're just smaller. But basically, these guys carry air into the lungs and they distribute it to the alveoli. So from the trachea, where we were, like we went from the nose to the mouth to the voice box to the throat to the trachea, and then we're dividing into two bronchi. So the trachea branches into two bronchi, which further divides into smaller bronchiole. And like I said, these structures, they carry air to the lungs and they give it to the alveoli. And then it sounds like a pasta, like an Italian dish, but anywho, that's not the same thing. So the lungs are the main organs of the respiratory system. They are composed of lobes and are responsible for gas exchange between the air and the blood streams. So then we have I think the number one player in all of this system are the alveoli. Not only because it sounds like a really yummy dish, but because the alveoli, they're like tiny little air sacs, and they're at the end of the bronchioles. So these tiny little air sacs, they're surrounded by capillaries, which is part of the circulatory system. But basically, all you need to know is that the alveoli provide a surface for gas exchange to occur. They're the ones who take oxygen from the lungs and give it to the circulatory system through the capillaries. We'll talk more about that later, but I think it's really cool. And then, like I said, the last thing was the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is a muscle that contracts, and when it contracts, it allows for inhalation. So every time it contracts, you have to that's the contraction, and then relaxation. So the diaphragm helps us breathe. It's basically the muscle that makes inhaling and exhaling possible. So let's talk about the breathing mechanics and more about the diaphragm, really. So basically, you need to know this for the TEAS exam. We have inhalation, and inhalation is when the diaphragm contracts. I already told you this. But in summary, breathing involves the coordination of various muscles to ensure that the intake of oxygen and the removal of carbon dioxide is happening. So we need to breathe to survive, because too much CO2 in the body will not be good, and we need oxygen. So breathing is essential. So the air travels from the nasal cavity when we inhale because of our diaphragm. For when we inhale, it goes from the nose to the alveoli, where gas exchange occurs, where basically the alveoli will take the carbon from the blood, the carbon, which is a toxic gas, and it will exchange it for oxygen. I love this part of the respiratory system. We'll talk more about it so that it makes sense to you too, and you can get excited about it too. So the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles play a vital role in expanding and contracting the chest cavity, which facilitate inhalation and exhalation, which makes it possible for gas exchange to happen. That's how they play a huge role to the system as a whole. So let's really dig deep into understanding how the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are exchanged. So the alveoli, like I said before, they're the primary sites of gas exchange in the respiratory system. They're really small, and they look like grapes, and they have thin walls, and they're surrounded by capillaries. It's really important that you remember how they look, because maybe they will ask you about this, but not only that, it's important that you understand how it's structured so that you understand how oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchange, how one is taken out the body and the other is taken in the body, and specifically in the blood. So like I said, the alveoli, they're small, they look like grapes, and they have thin walls, and they're surrounded by capillaries, which are part of the circular or cardiovascular system. So when we breathe in oxygen from the inhaled air, so it moves across all the way down to the thin walls of the alveoli. And now the alveoli have this fresh oxygen all around it. And the capillaries, remember, alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. And the capillaries have the toxic gas, which is carbon dioxide. And through a process of diffusion, they just exchange it. As you can see, it's literally like that. We will talk about diffusion and what it means, but look at this screen. This is how it works. There is blood in capillaries, and because air just came in through the alveoli, now it exchanged. It's important for blood to have oxygen. So the oxygen from the alveoli goes into the capillary, and the carbon dioxide from the blood or from the body cells goes inside into the alveoli, and they release when we exhale. So every single inhale and exhale is very important. So let's talk more about how this diffusion happens. And let's dig deeper into this carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange. So diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So in the case of the respiratory system, oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse across the alveoli and the capillaries because of the concentration gradient. So because, like I said, remember this, diffusion is the movement of molecules. Molecules are moving from high concentration to low concentration. So because there is high concentration in the alveoli when we inhale the oxygen, now the alveoli has a lot of oxygen because we just inhaled it. Now the molecules will move from high to low. So wherever there was a high concentration of something, it will go where there isn't a lot of it. So that is how when we inhale oxygen, it goes to the alveoli, which is surrounded by the capillaries. Now the alveoli has a lot of oxygen that we've just inhaled, and because of diffusion, the alveoli have a higher concentration of oxygen compared to the capillaries. And as a result, oxygen molecules move from the alveoli into the capillaries. And conversely, the capillaries have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide compared to the alveoli. So this causes carbon dioxide molecules to diffuse from capillaries into the alveoli. And so you don't really need to be really smart or like remember a lot of stuff. Just tell yourself little stories, or even remind yourself of stuff that you've already that you've seen for yourself, that you've experienced for yourself. Little experiments happen every day. So for me, I like to take these iron or a vitamin C. I don't have the iron with me right now, but I take these pills. They're vitamins, and some of it is like you have to put it in water. And it's funny because when I put it in water, the water becomes pink or orange depending, but there was a lot of pigment in the pill. So that is how diffusion works. It goes from a lot of it to none of it. That's why the water changes colors, because all that coloring gradient leaves the pill and goes where there wasn't any color. And that's how the alveoli and the carbon dioxide works. I hope I'm making sense. Let me know in the comment how we're doing. So just to make sure that we understand, this is the picture of how it all works. Carbon out, oxygen in. So the next step is to know some of the factors or diseases that are affecting the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is a very vital part of our body, and it helps us breathe and obtain oxygen. And there's various factors that can affect the respiratory system and impact our overall health and its overall function. So let's explore some of the key factors that influences the respiratory system. So like we said, smoking, it's one of the most significant factors that negatively affect the respiratory system. The harmful chemicals in tobacco smoke can damage the airway, it can damage the lungs, and it can also lead to really chronic and really tough respiratory conditions like COPD, lung cancer. And smoking is not even bad for the person smoking, but secondhand smoke can also have really bad effects. And that's something that not a lot of people talk about or know, but both the smokers and the non-smoker are affecting the same way. If it was up to me, if I was the president of the world, I would just stop making tobacco, like ban it. We ban books, we ban people, we cancel people, but we can't ban tobacco, and that baffles me. But we have air pollution, breathing in polluted air due to pollutants such as smoke, dust, chemicals. It can irritate the airways, it can cause inflammation, it can increase the risk of infections and allergies. And allergies like pollen, mold, pets, allergies, whatever allergy, you can really trigger a reaction, and like an allergic reaction. And it really depends on how sensitive you are as an individual. But when these allergens are inhaled, when you inhale pollen or pet hair, whatever you're allergic to, it can cause respiratory system like sneezing, coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath. We'll talk more about it in the immune system and how it fights allergies. I think it's super cool. And we have occupational exposure, like I said, painting, chemicals, mining. If you work in manufacturing, you can be like exposed to fumes, dust, chemicals, asbestos, and all of these things can lead to respiratory problems over time. So it's always important, even as a firefighter. It's really important to always wear protective equipment to minimize the risk of diseases when you're working a workplace like this. And we have respiratory infections, viruses, coronavirus. We have bacterial infections. All these infections and viruses, even the flu, can affect the respiratory system and cause conditions like the common cold, influenza, bronchitis, pneumonia. And these infections can lead to symptoms such as coughing, congestion, sore throat, difficulty breathing. Maintaining good hygiene, practicing regular hand washing, and getting vaccinated can help reduce the risk of respiratory infections. And finally, we have medical conditions like asthma, I said TB, and whatever else you can think of. These medical conditions can make it difficult to inhale or exhale normal amounts of air, and this can lead to shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, wheezing, and all of that. And lifestyle factors, we have two more. Okay, let's go through this. Lifestyle factors: poor lifestyle choices, lack of physical activities, and lack of physical activities can weaken the muscles, the mind too, but we're talking about muscles here. And it can also lead to obesity, which can put a lot of additional stress on the lungs and making breathing more difficult. But on the other hand, regular exercising and maintaining a healthy diet can improve the respiratory function. And we also have age and genetics. So finally, the respiratory system can be influenced by factors that are really outside of our control, such as age and genetics. I feel like age and genetics and maybe allergens are something that we can't control, or medical conditions, maybe. But it's just the process of aging, of being human. All of us, as we age, our lung function just naturally declines, and the risk of respiratory conditions may increase. And in addition, don't feel like you really need to memorize everything about the respiratory system. Or like factors that affect it. If you were able to retain 3 things like exercising, smoking, and age, or allergies, whatever else, that's good. But don't feel like you need to know everything in detail. It just comes naturally with experience. But finally, our last learning goal was to describe the relationship between the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. So the respiratory and the cardiovascular system have a very close relationship, and they work together to make sure that gas exchange and oxygenation of the body is being done efficiently. So we can summarize the relationship between the two in this way. First, we have the transport of oxygen, we have the removal of carbon dioxide, we have the exchange of gases, and the regulation of pH. So the respiratory system takes in oxygen from the environment and it transfers it into the bloodstream by diffusion, like we've learned. And the oxygenated blood is being pumped through the heart to all parts of the body, and it's basically supplying oxygen to all of the cells. And then we also have the removal of carbon dioxide, and that's when the cardiovascular system transports the carbon dioxide from the body cells to the lungs. So it's really cool that the carbon is being flushed out by the blood. The blood will literally pick up everywhere that the carbon dioxide is, and it will pick it up, deposit it to the lungs so that the exchange and the removal of carbon dioxide can happen. And finally, both systems work together to maintain the perfect pH balance in the blood. When the blood has too much CO2, it is the cardiovascular system's job to take this CO2 and deposit it to the blood, and we cannot leave the blood just not have enough oxygen, so the respiratory system will deposit the oxygen, and this exchange makes it so that the blood has the perfect pH balance every single time. So there is a little bit of review that we need to do, and at the end of every chapter there's going to be a little quiz, so make sure that you answer all the questions, and I will let you know what the answers are in the comment section. And before we end though, there are some vocab words that you should know to pass the TEAS exam, and that is ventilation, perfusion, hypoventilation, hyperventilation. So ventilation itself is the movement of air in and out of the lungs. It's another way to say breathing, but of course they're gonna come up with 10 million ways to say breathing, but ventilation is the movement of air in and out of the body. And then we have hypoventilation and hyperventilation. And a good way for me to remember is, like, I always tell people, I guess it's part of my vocabulary, but I always tell people, oh, she's so hyper. I don't know if somebody else, do other people say this? But when I say that someone is hyper, it means that they have a lot of energy. They're like kind of fidgety, and but hyperventilation, I can't say this word. Ventilation. Hyperventilation is fast breathing. That's a way that I remember it. It's like fast breathing. And hypo is slow breathing. Like if you really don't say hyper at all, a good way to remember that hypo is low, it's like a hippopotamus. I'm just assuming that they're slow. So you just need to remember one of them and you'll get the other one. Either you say she's hyper, they're hyper, and hyperventilation, that's fast. And hypoventilation, that's slow breathing. And perfusion is delivering blood to the body's tissues, organs, or cells. It's basically like, do you ever get that, oh, she's getting a perfusion? I don't know. I've been in the hospital too many times. I don't really know if people speak my kind of English, but in the hospital we say perfusion a lot of the time, and sometimes you might not hang out to the hospital a lot to be like, it might just be your first time, but perfusion is just like giving blood, like giving blood, transmitting, like you're being given blood. It's like an IV. I don't know what IV stands for, but perfusion just means that somebody's giving you blood so that it goes to the body's tissues. Sometimes it's somebody, sometimes it's just like the blood coming from place A to place B. Yeah, let's say that. Perfusion is blood going from place A to place B. But with that being said, let's go to Unit 3.